So Carney's been on that since day one. He's understood exactly what he's dealing with in dealing with Trump. The advantage of Mark Carney, of course, is his deep experience on the world stage. When he walks into a room, well, everybody knows him. And he's given a lot of attention every time.
Wait, this is the part nobody expected. Canada isn't arguing with Donald Trump anymore. It isn't pleading, posturing, or firing off emotional press releases. It's doing something far more unsettling for Washington. It's quietly changing the board. Because while most people are still focused on Trump's tariffs, his threats, and his familiar pressure tactics, Mark Carney is boarding a plane to China. And that trip is not about smiles, symbolism, or diplomacy theater. It's about leverage. Real leverage. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't warn, and doesn't ask for permission.
There is so much going on across Canada and across the world, so there's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about today. And I want to start with Mark Carney heading to China next week. What is the significance of that meeting with the Chinese president?
Well, this is the culmination of 6 months of hard work by Carney looking to establish better trading relationships outside of our US-Canada trading relationship, which is, of course, the biggest one we have, but it's fraught right now. Trump has been going after us with tariffs, hurting our economy intentionally. He's also said that the renegotiation of the Canada-US-Mexico trade deal is anything but a done deal in advance. So we have to start doing exactly what Carney's been doing, talking to the Europeans, going to Great Britain, talking to markets, saying we've got a lot of big infrastructure projects coming in Canada, get on board. Talking with Danielle Smith of Alberta, saying, no, we're going to really be able to use our natural resources, but we're going to do it responsibly.
Here's where things get interesting. From the moment Carney stepped into this role, he understood something that took Canada years to fully accept. Donald Trump doesn't respond to loyalty, alignment, or restraint. He responds to power, specifically economic power. And more specifically than that, leverage that can't be ignored. For decades, Canada built its economic strategy around a single assumption, that deep integration with the United States was not only efficient, but safe. The U.S. market was predictable. The rules were stable. Disputes stayed within institutions. Even disagreements followed a script. That assumption collapsed the moment Trump entered the picture. Under Trump, trade stopped being technical and started being personal. Tariffs weren't policy tools anymore. They were weapons. Autos, agriculture, aluminum, steel. Entire sectors found themselves exposed overnight, not because of market conditions, but because of politics, grievances, or leverage plays that shifted without warning.
There's a lot of work that can be done between Canada and China. One of the things I'll be watching, Will, is whether or not we remove the 100% tariffs that we slapped on Chinese electric vehicles to please the Americans. Pleasing the Americans got us precisely nothing, except the fact that we have to pay twice as much for an electric vehicle in Canada, then neither of them are made here. And why would we continue to please the Americans? Because all that got us was a lot of grief. It got us huge tariffs on Canadian canola and other products. We've hurt our agricultural sector to please the Americans. I think that that's the type of thing that Carney should be correcting in quick order.
Yeah, and and again, the significance of that not meeting with the Chinese president in the last 8 years. So Mark Carney, obviously on top of it.
And that's the moment Ottawa quietly reached a conclusion it never wanted to admit out loud. Dependence wasn't just inconvenient anymore. It was dangerous. So Carney adjusted. Not rhetorically, structurally. Let's start with something most people overlook about Mark Carney himself. When he walks into a room, any room, he isn't treated like a regional politician trying to get attention. He's treated like a known quantity. Former central banker, crisis manager, someone markets listen to, someone governments take seriously. That matters more than headlines ever will. Every word he says lands with weight because people assume it's backed by calculation, not impulse. That credibility is what makes this China trip different from anything Canada has done in years. Because this visit doesn't happen unless something fundamental has changed. For nearly a decade, Canada-China relations were effectively frozen. Trust collapsed after high-profile diplomatic crises. Trade deteriorated. Dialogue stalled. Entire channels of communication went cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a breakdown. So why now? The answer is risk. Under Trump, Canada learned, painfully, that relying on a single dominant economic partner creates a vulnerability that can be exploited repeatedly. Tariffs on Canadian autos weren't theoretical. Pressure on agriculture wasn't symbolic. Threats weren't idle. They moved markets. They froze investment. They cost jobs. Absorbing that pressure quietly stopped being viable. So instead of reacting, Carney started redesigning Canada's position. Over the past 6 months, he's been laying groundwork that didn't generate much noise but changed the underlying structure of Canada's options. Talking to European partners, reinforcing ties with the UK, signaling openness to massive infrastructure investment, reframing energy policy conversations with provinces like Alberta, particularly Danielle Smith, around using natural resources strategically but responsibly. None of that was accidental. It was preparation. Because at the heart of this China visit is a simple but uncomfortable realization in Ottawa, Canada allowed itself to become overexposed. For a long time, that exposure felt safe. Under Trump, it became a liability. Here's the part most people misunderstand. This isn't about pivoting away from the United States. It's not about choosing China over America. It's about something far more pragmatic, making sure the United States is no longer the only option.
So going to China, working with the Chinese doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything that China does. That's not the way the world works. It's not the way trade works. And we're going to sit down and we're going to start making the type of deal that will lead to greater exports. You know, we talk about Venezuela. Some people opined over the weekend that Canada was going to suffer because of Trump's invasion of Venezuela. This just in, nothing's been repaired or improved in Venezuela. The Chinese were getting about 2/3 of the oil that came out of Venezuela. They're going to be looking for other sources. And Canada could easily be that source. So there is opportunity there.
When a country has multiple large markets, North America, Europe, Asia, pressure from any one direction loses its bite. Tariffs become negotiable, threats become noise, and intimidation stops working. That's the strategic logic driving this trip. Carney isn't chasing approval from Beijing. He's restoring symmetry to relationships that had become one-sided. He's ensuring that no single country, no matter how powerful, can apply pressure without consequences. And this is where the conversation stops being abstract and becomes very real. Take electric vehicles. Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs wasn't imposed because Canada feared Chinese cars flooding its streets. It was imposed to stay aligned with US policy. Full stop. That alignment came at a cost. Canadian consumers paid more. Competition was restricted. Innovation slowed. And despite all that loyalty, Canada still got hit with tariffs anyway. So the question became unavoidable. Why absorb economic pain to please an administration that offers no protection in return? If Canada reconsiders those EV tariffs, the effects are immediate. Chinese EVs enter the Canadian market, prices drop, competition increases. But the real impact isn't in Canada, it's south of the border, because Chinese EVs sitting in Canada sit right next to the US market. That alone undermines the logic of Trump's tariff wall, which depends on controlling access and isolating competitors. Canada wouldn't need to confront Trump directly. It would simply make his strategy less effective. That's not retaliation, that's pressure. And pressure forces recalculation. Now layer in agriculture. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola didn't happen because of supply issues or quality concerns. They happened because politics poisoned the relationship. Farmers paid the price. Entire rural regions felt the hit, and there were few alternative markets large enough to absorb the shock. At the same time, Canada's auto sector was absorbing damage from US tariffs despite years of cooperation and alignment. Plants faced uncertainty, investment slowed, workers were left hanging. This is the context in which the China visit matters. If Canada can restore agricultural access while opening room for trade-offs in EVs, the equation changes completely. It stops being about unilateral sacrifice and becomes negotiated exchange. Farmers regain markets, consumers benefit from competition, manufacturers gain flexibility, supply chains diversify. Most importantly, Canada regains agency. This isn't about ideological alignment. It's not about endorsing China's politics or policies. Trade doesn't work that way. Engagement doesn't require agreement. From my perspective, that's one of the smartest parts of this strategy. It separates values from leverage. It acknowledges reality without pretending the world is simpler than it is. And there's more. Global energy markets are shifting again. With instability in places like Venezuela, supply patterns are changing. China has historically taken a large share of Venezuelan oil. If that flow becomes unreliable, New sources matter. Canada happens to have one. That doesn't mean blind alignment. It means opportunity, if handled carefully. Trump remains central to this story, but not in the way he used to be. His approach has always been consistent. Apply pressure where dependence exists. Escalate when costs can be externalized. Push until someone blinks. That only works when targets lack alternatives. Carney's strategy removes that condition. Every aggressive move toward Canada now carries unintended consequences. Tariffs risk pushing trade elsewhere. Pressure accelerates diversification. Threats encourage new partnerships. The harder Trump pushes, the less leverage he actually has. That's the quiet shift happening here. Carney isn't issuing warnings, he's changing incentives, and once incentives change, behavior follows. That's why this trip matters so much in Washington, even if no one says it out loud. It signals that Canada has reached a point where intimidation no longer produces compliance. It produces resistance, and not loud resistance, strategic resistance. This only works if the person executing it is taken seriously. Carney is. He understands markets. He understands trade-offs. He understands that credibility matters more than spectacle. That's why this is a state visit, not a courtesy stop. And that's why it's being watched closely, not just in Beijing, but in Washington. Zoom out, and you see the larger shift. Canada is no longer relying on goodwill. It's building interlocking economic relationships. Europe stabilizes security. Asia expands trade options. Energy anchors reliability. Each layer reduces vulnerability. Together, they send a message Donald Trump understands instinctively. Canada is no longer an easy target. This isn't about China alone. It's about Canada entering a new phase of statecraft. Not reactive, not emotional, not loud, precise. Trump's tariffs and threats forced Canada to evolve. Carney's China visit shows how far that evolution has gone. Because when a country builds enough options, threats stop working. And right now, Mark Carney is making sure Donald Trump has to think twice before every move. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.